Hi, welcome to the final chapter of our semester of our course. Hi, welcome to the final chapter of our course this semester, Teaching Approaches and Instructional Issues. In the past few weeks, we have discussed several theories, hypotheses, and approaches to second language teaching and instruction. In this chapter, we will be moving to application and to the practices or approaches or methods that have been used for the past hundreds of years in teaching a second language based on these hypotheses. First, let's distinguish between the three terms approach, method, and technique. We will begin with an old definition, 1963 by Anthony. Approach a teaching perspective that reflects a theoretical view or model, and this is what we had discussed in chapter 4. Then we move to the method, which is a set of procedures that are consistent, that is related to a certain approach. Therefore, here when we talk about method, we mean a set of procedures. And then finally we come to the technique, which is a specific tool, a specific procedure that is related to a certain method. And by classroom tools, we mean things like dialogues, language drills, activities like flashcards, speaking activities, writing, whatever. Now, in a newer definition of what method, approach, and technique are, Richards and Rogers suggested an umbrella term, which is the word method. We start from the word method and then we move on. Richards and Rogers defined the approach as the theory of language and language learning. Then we have the design, that is the design of the course or the subject, and which includes the content, the roles of the teachers and the learners, and the material types. Finally, we have the procedure, which is the actual use of techniques, the steps in which the teacher presents the second language objective or lesson. Therefore, a method includes the approach, the design, and the procedure. And what we will be discussing in our lesson this week and the one after are the methods of teaching a second language. So, what second language teaching methods have been used throughout history? We will begin with the old methods, and then we will move to the new methods. There are 9 methods which we will be discussing. In this video, part 1, we will be looking at old methods of teaching a second language, methods that had been used until the 19th, early 20th century. Antiquity, the grammar translation method, the direct method or the Berlitz method, and finally, the audiolingual method. Let's begin with language teaching in antiquity. When we talk about antiquity, we mean the period during which Latin and Greek were the predominant languages during the Roman Empire and during the rule of the Greek in the Greek Republic. That is 750 before Christ and 450 after Christ. That is more than 2,000 years ago. You know that age was the age of philosophers, educators, etc. Philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, etc. During that time, in order to learn the language, which is Latin or Greek, educators used the hermenumata, which means a set of standardized texts, that is a fixed set of texts in which Latin or Greek was taught to learners. These texts included several common features such as vocabulary lists that are organized according to subject or to alphabet, and conversational dialogues. Students were taught to begin by learning vocabulary, and then they would practice grammatical rules and vocabulary by reading these instructive Humme method texts. They were taught to compare between their language and the target language, which was either Latin or Greek. That method affected the method that came after, which is also related to that way of teaching, and it spread from the Middle Ages, that is 500 after Christ, until the 1800s. That method was called colloquy or dialogues. It consisted of a series of fixed texts that included dialogues related to the language, which was the target language, and students had to memorize these long pieces of text which were in the form of dialogues. Let's look at an example by a famous writer or grammarian, who is Joseph Priestley, and this is an example from his book in the late 18th century. It consisted of a conversation between an educator and a learner. Question and answer. What is grammar? Grammar is the art of using words properly. How many parts does grammar consist? Of 4: orthography, etymology, syntax, and prosody. Therefore, grammatical rules were memorized in the form of dialogues. There was no application like we do nowadays. Let's look here at some examples of Humme text and the texts that were used later when dialogues were employed in teaching a second language. Here we have the target language and the alphabet of the target language, and then the pronunciation in English letters or English alphabet, and finally here we have the English translation of the terms or vocabulary words, etc. Okay, now we move to the second method, which is called the grammar translation method. Note that this term is a more recent term of an older term, which was the classical method. So, we said before that during Antiquity, Latin and Greek were taught by using Humme method texts and comparing L1 to L2. Now, after the Middle Ages, that is in the 500s until the 1800s, that is the 19th century, Latin and Greek were taught through translation. So, first, grammar translation method was called the classical method when it was during the 500s until the 1800s, and it was used to translate Latin and Greek to the target language, or that is to translate Latin and Greek to L1 or from L1 to Latin and Greek. The main objective of scholars and educators during that time was to develop the knowledge to read and write, that is, focus on grammar and language structures and forms, and not to converse and speak in the target language. Therefore, there was no attention to pronunciation. The attention was on grammatical rules and on vocabulary lists that were memorized, and finally, the focus was on translating text from L1 to L2 and from L2 to L1. And as I said before, that when it was the classical method, translation was to Latin and Greek or from Latin and Greek. Therefore, students would translate classical works such as epics and poems, etc., to their native language. Now, there was a turning point in the 17th century when a reforming educator called Johannes Amos Comenius objected to that way of language teaching through grammar only, and he promoted the use of vernacular languages in education. By vernacular, we mean languages that are spoken by a certain group of people in a certain country or region. Comenius was against teaching Latin and Greek grammar when there were more important languages that are being spoken in Europe. Now, until the 1900s, the classical method was still used for teaching languages other than Latin and Greek. And when the classical method was used to languages other than Latin and Greek, it was called the grammar translation method, and the term appeared in the late 18th century. It was a teaching method with emphasis on grammar and translation of full sentences. Please check textbook pages 108-109 for an example of key features that are present in a grammar translation method book. You can see here examples of translated texts. Therefore, the grammar translation method, even though it left its mark for hundreds of years, however, it did not focus on oral fluency, and this is one of its weaknesses. Now we come to the third method, which is the direct method. At the end of the 19th century and throughout much of the 20th century, a new approach appeared in North America, and that is because of one of many linguists, mainly Maximilian Berlitz, who was a German immigrant who developed what was called the Berlitz method, following his name. And he founded the Berlitz language schools in 1878 in USA. Note that the Berlitz method, or the direct method, is still used in many language classrooms nowadays, and the Berlitz schools and centers are still there. We even have one here in Lebanon, in Beirut. Let's look at the main characteristics or propositions by the Berlitz method. There is a story behind how it spontaneously started, and please watch the video which I shared on Google Classroom to have an idea about the story behind this great method of teaching a second language. However, it has its weaknesses, and we will be looking at them soon. The underlying principles of this method is that there should be an exclusive use of the target language. That is, the teacher should not refer to the first language at all inside the classroom. Notice how this is totally opposite to the two methods we talked about first, which included translation. However, this method did not include L1 at all, not even in speaking inside the classroom. And also, opposite to the ones before, it avoided explicit direct teaching of grammatical rules, and grammar should be taught through dialogues and conversations. And finally, only useful basic vocabulary were taught through concrete objects and pictures, etc. Now, the direct method proved to be successful when it was used in private schools, whether elementary, high school, or intermediate schools or centers, and when the students were very motivated and there were small groups of people. However, it was less successful when it was applied in large public schools because it required a lot of activities and oral activities, and it was hard to do this in large classrooms, and when the teacher was not native. Why? Because it focused on the exclusive use of the target language. Finally, we come to the audiolingual method, which started in the mid-1900s, that is, during World War II, when they had to train specialists to acquire a target language quickly. The ALM was influenced by the behaviorist views and structuralist views. You can refer to the contrastive analysis theory in chapter 4, where we talked about the habituation of stimulus and response. Therefore, the ALM required a lot of repetition and language drills, that is, to practice pattern drills by repeating the same phrase and changing one unit, that is one word. Therefore, the ALM focused on breaking L1 habits and replacing them by new patterns related to the grammatical rules of the new language. However, grammar was not taught explicitly, that is, directly, but through repetition of patterns. This language lab exercises and drills of the ALM were successful to teach certain structures and so on, but not to teach conversational skills. These are some examples you can view on the PowerPoint. Now please try to reflect and judge on these methods. Thank you.